Hi everyone, my name is Da Yan, and I'm an assistant professor from the Computer Science Department of the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I'm here to present our ICDE 2020 short paper titled PrefixFPM, a parallel framework for general-purpose frequent pattern mining. First, let me introduce our target problem, that is frequent pattern mining. We will illustrate the concepts using item sets as patterns. In this slide, we have a database of 6 transactions indicating the items that people buy from a supermarket. From this database, we would like to mine patterns in the form of item sets, where an item set with 3 items is shown at the bottom. For a pattern, we have the concept of pattern length. In our item set pattern, the size is 3 since we have 3 items in the set. If we check the item set against the database, we can see that transactions 4 and 6 cover our item set, and therefore we say that the support count of our pattern is 2. We can also define support as a fraction of transactions in the database that covers our pattern, which is 1/3 in our case. Here is a recap of the concepts in frequent pattern mining. We have a database of transactions, and we want to find those patterns that are covered by a significant number of transactions in our database. We remark that the pattern type is not limited to item set. Depending on the database type, a pattern can also be a subsequence, a subgraph, or even a subtree. For example, in the database of chemical compounds, it would be interesting to find frequent subgraph structures that often hint useful functionalities. As another example, we can also mine subtree patterns from an XML file, such as that of DBLP, to capture patterns like frequent co-authorships in a particular journal. It is also common to add constraints to the desired patterns, such as that 2 elements in a sequential pattern cannot be more than 3 elements away in a sequence transaction. In this slide, we show a tree structures transaction, and if we will consider embedded pattern which only requires the preservation of ancestor-descendant relationships between nodes, then the pattern BBD is covered, even though it is not and induce a subgraph of the tree's transaction. In fact, frequent pattern mining is NP-hard, and it's important to utilize all CPU cores in a multi-core machine for effective pattern mining. Therefore, we aim to design a parallel framework that is able to keep all CPU cores busy in mining patterns. An important goal is to make our framework's programming interface general enough for mining all kinds of patterns. Remarks that the pattern of item set is special because there's no order of the items in a set. So we can use algorithms that define its own order for effective mining, such as FP growth algorithm. However, we do not target this problem as it has already been well addressed by Google's parallel FP growth algorithm, which is shown at the top. We consider those patterns where it matters how elements are ordered or connected. Our framework is designed based on the idea of prefix projection, the idea of which will be reviewed shortly. Our framework is called PrefixFPM, as we use prefix projection and tackles general frequent pattern mining, or FPM in short. An important feature of PrefixFPM is that we consider algorithms that check patterns in the depth-first order of pattern growth. Let's now illustrate the idea of prefix projection by considering the problem of mining frequent subsequence patterns from a sequence database. Here, we can see that database D has 4 sequences. If we consider pattern A, then S4 is filtered as it has no A, and the n-scored positions are those that match A. We call such a database as a projected database, projected by pattern A. Now, if we grow pattern A with 1 more element B, we only need to continue matching from the projected database of A. We will continue matching B starting from the underscored positions. This will give us the projected database of AB. We can further grow the pattern by C and check against the projected database of AB to find those sequence transactions that contain pattern ABC. Prefix span actually checks the patterns in depth-first pattern growing order. Let us consider a sequence database where there are only 3 types elements, A, B, and C. We will first grow an initial empty pattern by A to obtain A's projected database. If it contains sufficient transactions, we consider A as frequent and output it. We then grow pattern A into AA, create its projected database from that A. Assume that the projected database does not have sufficient transactions, so AA is infrequent. Then AA is pruned, and we do not need to consider to grow AA further. After backtracking to pattern A, we will consider the next child pattern, AB, and assume that it is frequent. Then we will continue to check its child patterns, ABA, ABB, and ABC. We will continue to check all the patterns in that first order of the pattern growth tree until all frequent patterns are found. This algorithm has several desirable features. Firstly, we only check a child pattern over its parent pattern's projected database, which gets smaller as the parent pattern grows in size. Secondly, we can prune the whole subtree in our pattern search space once a pattern is found to be infrequent. Thirdly, we will remember how a parent pattern is matched to each transaction, so that a child pattern can continue its matching rather than starting from scratch. Finally, all child subtrees can be checked independently and are therefore amenable to parallel computing. We remark that this prefix projection idea is not limited to mining sequential patterns. For example, we can find subgraph patterns from a graph database in a similar manner. For this purpose, we need to encode each graph pattern into a sequence representation. This allows us to run a PrefixFPM style algorithm on the encoded sequence pattern space. This will, however, give rise to duplicate patterns since different sequences can correspond to the same subgraph pattern. Taking tree patterns as an example, where we do not differentiate the order of children nodes. Here, we can simply encode a tree pattern using depth-first node traversal, except that we need to add a $sign each time we backtrack. For example, for the first tree, we have B, A, B, $D, $B, $C, We can see that the other two trees are the same pattern, but with different children order, but their encodings are totally different. Therefore, a canonical encoding is uniquely defined for each pattern as the smallest sequence encoding among that pattern's all possible encodings. During the actual mining, we only consider and grow a pattern if its encoding is canonical. As the pattern search tree in the slide shows, G0's encoding is canonical, but G1's is not. G1 and G0 are actually the same subgraph pattern, and therefore we prune G1 to avoid the duplicate pattern checking. Pattern growth is usually by an additional element each time. And subgraph patterns also do not need to consider all growing possibilities. For example, we do not need to consider growing from node 2 in the slide, since X is not on the rightmost path. This is because our encoding is in depth-first order, and an earlier encoding in defects order should have considered that branch. Now, let's briefly overview the related work. There are a lot of earlier works that adapt the a priori algorithm on MapReduce to grow patterns in a breadth-first order, where patterns of size I is checked only if all smaller patterns have been checked. For example, size 1 patterns will first be mined. These patterns are then saved to Hadoop digital file system or HDFS in short. The next MapReduce job will then load them back, mine size 2 patterns grown from them, and save to HDFS. They are then loaded back to mine patterns of size 3. A problem with such a MapReduce solution is that transactions and patterns are repeatedly saved to HDFS and loaded back, which incurs a lot of I/O overhead. Secondly, the patterns need to be checked against the entire transaction database rather than a small projected database. A satisfactory solution that uses the depth-first FP growth algorithm is proposed by Google researchers, which makes the FP growth algorithm run in parallel with a MapReduce job. The works we reviewed so far are on item set patterns. Regarding subgraph patterns, a depth-first solution is proposed in ICDE 2014 using 2 rounds of MapReduce. In the first job, transactions are partitioned among machines, and each machine only mines its local frequent patterns in depth-first order. These patterns are then unioned and given to the second job for refinement. This is correct because if a pattern is not frequent on all local transaction databases, it cannot be frequent globally for the whole database. The work actually also incorporates some local patterns that are below, but only slightly below the support threshold to further improve the refinement effectiveness. More recently, Arabic proposed a very user-friendly programming interface for graph mining called embedding-centric programming. Here, embedding is a materialized subgraph, and these subgraphs are still grown in a breadth-first manner for checking. Arabic is a distributed system, and subgraph materialization makes it network I/O bound. A follow-up work called RStream is a single machine out-of-core system that follows Arabic's API, but is found to be more efficient. However, RStream is disk I/O bound. We remarked that Arabic tries to combine frequent subgraph pattern mining with problems like click mining, but they are different problems. For example, clicks are predefined patterns, and the problem finds match the data instances in the data graph. But our problem does not predefine subgraph patterns, but checks data instances in our database to find these frequent patterns. In fact, Arabic's API forces dense subgraph mining problems to conduct unnecessary subgraph isomorphism check, as well as subgraph materialization, which can otherwise be handled by simple node backtracking. Our G-Sync system satisfactorily addresses these weaknesses, and please check out our presentation on G-Syncer. We adopt a task-centric computational model where each pattern is associated with a task. The task will check if that pattern is frequent, and if so, it will grow the pattern by one more element to generate child patterns for further checking. If the projected database is big, child patterns are wrapped into independent tasks, which are then added to a task queue to be fetched by other tasks for mining. Otherwise, the task is efficient processed by the current thread itself, so the thread will directly process it in depth-first pattern growth order. This framework follows our T-Sync programming paradigm, and we encourage you to check it out. This slide shows how a thread processes a task, where line 2 first checks if we need to skip the current pattern, say its encoding is not canonical. Then line 4 will generate child patterns and their projected databases. Each child pattern is then processed in the while loop, whereas line 7 checks if we should wrap child patterns into tasks for concurrent processing. Otherwise, the current thread will call the same function in line 13 on the child pattern to check and grow it recursively. We make the task queue a stack so that tasks are fetched in depth-first priority. This strategy prioritizes old tasks to minimize memory footprint occupied by the project databases that are being mined upon. Our programming interface is shown here, but we have covered those user-defined functions of the task-based class in our previous slide. There is also a worker-based class, which creates initial size 1 pattern tasks and puts them into the task queue for concurrent processing. This is actually conducted by the statroot function, which also user-defined. Here we illustrate how our parallel framework divides the pattern search space. For example, thread 1 could be processing pattern AB. The next pattern in depth first order, which is AC, is fetched and processed by thread 2. Thread 3 and thread 4 will then process the next 2 patterns in depth first order. Note that these tasks may add more child pattern tasks into the current task queue, so that idle threads can then fetch them for processing. We also allow a pattern to be checked against a big projected database in parallel, which is helpful initially when there are not many tasks to keep all the CPU cores busy. We have open sourced our code on GitHub with detailed documentation, and there is also a video demo for you to check out. We implemented 3 algorithms on top of our PrefixFPM framework, which are parallel versions of PrefixSPM for sequence patterns, GSPAN for subgraph patterns, and Sleuth for embedded tree patterns. Our experiments show ideal speedup with the number of CPU cores in our server, which contains 32 CPU cores. Thank you for your attention, and here are my contact information and some useful links.